Welcome to week 5. This is the second class for this session. My name is Professor Trevor Miller at Valencia College, and I'm excited to talk to you about FDR's New Deal programs. So as we get into the material today, I ask you to try to keep a historical mindset, and then we're going to talk about the different programs associated with the New Deal. Now again, this material is meant to supplement your course material from your textbook, the videos and articles that are loaded in this course. It's not meant to replace it. As we start thinking about this program, the New Deal, I ask you to consider the people of the era. You have the haves and the have-nots, and many, many, many people that were unemployed around the country. The ideas of the time period, what people believed, what they thought, their relationships, not only to their relationships between other people, but their relationships to their ideas and politics of the era, and then what their motives were, what their individual motives were. Especially in this lesson, I ask you to keep what FDR's motives were as we progress through this lesson. FDR took office, within his first 100 days, he sought to get Americans back to work and get the economy moving in the right direction. Those were his initial goals. And to do that, he implemented a myriad of programs, some successful and some not. We're not going to talk about every single program here, but more we're going to discuss how these programs were aimed at reshaping American life, implementing social safety nets, getting Americans back to work, and preventing this type of catastrophe from ever happening again. So, some of the ones we're going to be looking at are the federal credit unions. So FDR implemented federal credit unions. And one of the interesting things about federal credit unions is that they don't pay federal tax. They are owned by the people who are their patrons, where banks are owned by a corporation or a corporate board. It's a little bit different way of doing business. This put the ownership in the hands of the people rather than big business. He also created things like the U.S. Travel Bureau. It's an organization aimed at enticing tourists from other countries to visit the United States so they can come spend their money and help boost the U.S. economy. FDR's first major goals was stabilizing the markets so that things didn't get worse. So one of the programs that he implemented to help ensure that people had trust in their institutions and their banking institutions was he created the Federal Deposit Insurance Company, or FDIC. This program basically insured people's money up to $250,000 per bank account. To the American population, this was a huge relief, knowing that the United States would cover any loss to that amount. Another one was the Gold Reserve Act of 1934, where he called for individuals to sell their gold to the U.S. government. The government would melt it down into bars. This was then stored in Fort Knox, and it helped bolster America's trading ability with other nations and their borrowing ability with other nations. Sought to reshape the way Americans conducted their lives. One of those programs he implemented was the Federal Emergency Relief Act of 1933, or FARA. This program gave money to local and state governments that they could then lend out to other people in their jurisdictions that were destitute, that needed loans or needed monies to help them survive. Another program that was critically important was the Federal Surplus Commodities Program of 1933. This basically took excess food that the United States had in storage or would buy and place in storage, and then distribute out to those in need. So it was a way of feeding the mass populations that were unemployed and didn't have money to feed themselves. Now, these were programs that were already in existence before FDR took over. However, he completely reorganized and restructured these programs for the good of the American people. The idea here was that these existing programs could try to meet the needs of people all around the country. For example, the Army Corps of Engineers has been used since its inception to help build infrastructure in the United States. In modern times, they help build things like power plants, power grids, dams, waterways, you name it. However, that wasn't always necessarily the case. And here, FDR had them retool what they do so they could build levees, dams, canals. They helped dig out the Missouri River Basin to make it more navigable so we could get our goods and products to market at home and abroad. Now, aside from providing food, water, shelter, and jobs to American people, FDR found that there was something uniquely American, something about the American identity that needed to be preserved. So he instituted the programs on your screen here to help ensure that America's art, whether it be public, private, dance, you name it, music, were all preserved for future generations and that people could make money off of their art. Are set about creating a repository for historical information. He helped create and fund the National Archives and Records Administration. Essentially, what this did was this created a place to help store and protect all of America's vital information, things like the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, those documents that were fundamentally important to the American identity. It also became a repository for all important information like treaties and other unique historical goods and services. This created a museum. The National Archives in Washington, D.C. is far and away one of the most beautiful buildings that I've ever been in, certainly a public building. Another program of importance here was the Bonneville Power Administration. The idea here was that it would help manage the production and distribution of electricity from the Columbia River Project. Here were all aimed at rural and farm assistance. The idea was that if American farmers were producing and back to work, then America itself would get back to work. And here we have the Farm Credit Act of 1933, which basically allowed farmers to refinance their loans. Remember, the farmers were very mad that they had loans through banks and the interest rates were too high. Here, this law allowed them to refinance their mortgages, which was a first at this time period. Another area of importance here is the Shelter Belt Project of 1934. This would, in conjunction with the CCC, help to plant trees along the Great Plains to help reduce the effects of the Dust Bowl, help prevent erosion, and the loss of topsoil across the United States. All of these programs were aimed at getting Americans out of the Hoovervilles and into their own homes. One of these of importance here is the National Housing Act, which basically allowed the government to guarantee mortgages with banks. Also, this is focused on labor laws, and one of them here is the National Industrial Recovery Act, which provided a national minimum wage, the first of its kind in the country. And this also outlawed child labor nationwide. As stated earlier, FDR sought to change every aspect of American life. Here was programs that were focused on health and safety and land and wildlife conservation, Under the health and safety, we have the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938. This built upon what Teddy Roosevelt had done earlier in the century and essentially created what we now know today as the Food and Drug Administration. And the whole goal was to protect American consumers from unsafe food, drugs, and cosmetics. Other of additional note, the federal park system was reorganized, and the Taylor Grazing Act was aimed at controlling grazing cattle on federal land. America back on its feet commercially, FDR implemented a series of programs aimed at regulating trade, transportation of goods, and communications. One of these programs that is important here was the repealing of prohibition. This allowed Americans to be able to purchase alcohol once again. Additionally, he created a reciprocal trade agreement that led to an agreement between 19 countries to open up trade. So if they bought our goods, we would buy their goods, and it would be beneficial to all, certainly to help the world economy. Another one here is the Communications Act of 1934. This paved the way for the Federal Communications Act to regulate things like radio spectrum controls, so radio stations were not broadcasting on the same frequencies. Additionally, we have the Robinson-Pullman Act, which basically put into place things like preventions, laws against price gouging, certainly during emergencies, and it also put in rules against monopolies. Another area here is the Civil Aeronautics Act of 1938. This later becomes the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration. During this time period as well, Puerto Rico becomes part of the United States as a territory. FDR implements the Puerto Rico Reconstruction Act of 1935, aimed at building roads and infrastructure, power plants, utilities, waterways, those types of things within Puerto Rico, helped transforming the country into a modern American equivalent. Achievement of FDR's New Deal was the social safety net that was built into the American society in the form of Social Security. But the question becomes, why did America need Social Security? Why did we need this program in place? When the stock market crashed, there was only a sliver of Americans that had savings set aside in private accounts specifically for retirement. Also, people had pensions coming to them from corporations. They had worked for a specific amount of time and were due recoupons from those companies. Many corporations around the United States opted not to pay what was promised to their employers or to pay a reduced amount associated with their retirement. However, when Social Security was implemented, millions upon millions of Americans were not covered, and FDR wanted to cover all Americans, but he knew at the time when he implemented it could not be feasible. So populations that were excluded were people like domestic workers, agricultural workers, and this brought about half of the African American population was not initially eligible for Social Security because they were employed in seasonal work or domestic work. While Social Security was initially aimed at an old age pension program, it also brought about things like unemployment benefits, aid to dependent children, children who had lost parents. It created public health services and aid to people with severe disabilities. These metrics that are presented here are current as of spring 2023. So, about 67 million Americans per month receive Social Security benefits. The average benefit is about $1,800, and the life expectancy of Americans is well beyond what it once was. FDR's New Deal program, while not every program was successful, the goal here was to get Americans back to get them where they felt healthy and hopeful, and implemented systems of governance so that this type of catastrophe could never happen again. He also implemented social safety nets that helped create agencies that affect our lives in a myriad of ways today. No matter where you fall on the political spectrum, the New Deal has helped you or your family members in some way. This program has a lasting historical impact on the direction of the United States and progress as an American society.